Hello everybody, welcome to Catherine Sews. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can probably tell from my voice that for the last few days I've had a cold. So I've been home from work and my voice, it disappeared completely for a few days. So I was still able though to sew quite a few little projects that I'm happy to share with you. But I had to do it silently, and then I've added a voiceover to explain what I did. The theme for this week's video is self-care, ironically, because I really needed it. So what I did was I dove into the world of self-care and thoughtful gifts. 'Tis the season for comfort and joy. And so giving that gift of self-care, I think, is a beautiful way to show care for somebody on your gift list. So you know that on my channel, I'm all about upcycling and repurposing. But for this collection of gifts, I really wanted to give a sense of luxury and indulgence. So I started off at the fabric store, and the lady at the fabric store and I had so much fun running around the store finding these beautiful fabrics that coordinate so nicely. So I kept an eye on luxury and natural fibers. So the fabrics I bought were about half a yard of an unbleached organic pre-shrunk stretch terry cloth. And then I bought this gorgeous dusty rose silk charmeuse, and I bought the smallest amount possible, about 5 inches. Then of this beautiful quilting cotton, I got about 1/3 of a yard, and 1/3 of a yard of cotton flannelette, and 1/3 of a yard of a dusty rose linen. So those fabrics just are so nice all together, and it cost me about $40. But for that $40, I made about 8 gifts, and I still have a good amount of fabric left over of each, so I can keep going. I love that idea of just buying a small amount of a really luxurious fabric and making a few small gifts out of it. I think that's really lovely. So the first thing I'll be making in this video are the hair towel wraps, but not out of the microfiber. I really dislike that. Every time you wash a microfiber product, a million microfibers get into our water system, and it's really not great. I don't buy microfiber sheets or towels or anything. So this is unbleached organic cotton terry cloth. So yes, it was more expensive than something like a microfiber, but it's so much nicer for you, for your hair, and for the environment. So these hair towels are great. You twist your hair all up into a turban and it dries more quickly. You feel like you're having a spa treatment. Then I'll go into a couple of sleep masks. And the silk charmeuse is on the inside against your skin with the pretty cotton facing out. I had just a tiny bit left to do the little ruffle around the top and to encase an elastic in the silk as well, because that's really nice for your hair to have silk against it rather than an elastic. So the sleep masks are great and they're fun to make. Then with 100% linen, I made these scented rice bags. I put a few drops of essential oil in them so they smell heavenly, and you can use these for hot or cold therapy. So you can microwave these for a couple minutes, maybe a minute, and then flip it and then another minute, and then you can put it on sore muscles or across your eyes. It's just a nice little bit of therapeutic self-care. You can also put it in the freezer, and same thing, it's just it's a nice little indulgence, and the linen makes it particularly luxurious and beautiful. Then I combined some of those fabrics into a journal cover with a little bit of an ecru natural cotton lace. I love this little journal cover, and I think journaling is part of self-care. Finally, some cosmetic wipes out of the cotton flannelette and the organic cotton terry cloth. So those are a great little gift, also good for you and good for the environment. So that's what I'm up to today. I hope that sounds good to you, and if it does, let's get busy. Okay, to make the hair turban, the first thing I did on the organic cotton terry cloth was to draw a line across the stretch of the knit, so across the cross grain, and I wanted it about 23 inches long with right angles at both ends. And then coming up on the right hand side, about 10 inches, going straight up for the first 5 inches, and then curving in about 4 inches away from that. Then from that curve I went down along to the other end, just leaving about 2 inches to be straight at the other end. It looked a bit angular though, so I rounded off that end. And then I cut out the whole thing. This is 2 layers. This is on folded fabric. So I cut that out. So it's about 23 inches long by 10 inches at the highest point. And that highest point is about 4 inches in from that right side edge. Then I could flip it around and cut out a second one. So this was about half of a yard of fabric, and I was able to easily get 2 of the hair wraps out of it, with a few scraps left over to make lots of cosmetic wipes. All right, now often you'll see elastic at one end of a hair wrap like that, but I didn't really want the elastic. It just wasn't the aesthetic I was going for. So I took the scrap coming across the stretch of the knit, just a long skinny scrap, and I decided to make a little tiny loop out of that. So let me show you a fun way to make like a short strap or loop. So that's going across, and I just folded it right side together. It has a bit of a stretch to it. And I took that to my serger, and I serged off a chain of serging like that, just a little bit longer than the piece that I was serging. I wrapped that piece right side together around my serger tail and got it under the presser foot, and I lined up the left-hand edge of the presser foot with the folded edge of the fabric. Tucked the tail into that fold so it wasn't going to get caught into the serging, and then I serged that whole edge together. You can see that I'm pulling the tail of serging toward me and making sure that I still have the end of it sticking out at the end of the whole process here. So what that does is that it gives you a little tail to work with. So you see I'm grabbing the tail that I had serged around, and then it just helps you to flip that right side out. It's a little tricky at the beginning. You just got to help it get started by like tucking in that little end, and then you can just pull it right through. So that's a fun way of making a little strap or a little loop. So this was long enough for both of them. I only needed 4 inches for each, so this was more than enough for both. You can see when it comes out, it makes just like a perfect little loop, nice and sort of snug, and the serging makes it really strong, so I can stretch on it like that and the thread's not going to break. So then I cut off the raggedy ends and then cut it into 2 pieces that were 4 inches long. And then with 2 layers, right sides together for each of the hair wraps, I got it all lined up and then just started clipping the edges together. And with the edges clipped together, then I took my little loop and folded it in half and just made sure that the button that I was going to use would easily fit in the loop itself. And I tucked it in between the 2 layers with the loop end facing in, not the raw edges in. And I wanted to make sure I had at least a finger width above that bottom edge so that I could easily fold up a hem on that wrap, and that loop would just sort of be right within the hem. Doing a little back tack across the end of the loop to hold that in place before I take it to the serger. And this is the kind of project that, yeah, you can do the whole thing on your regular machine and just zigzag your edges, but it's so much faster on the serger. It really is one of those projects that makes you think, oh, maybe it's time to buy a serger. With the back tack secure, I can see that that's going to be plenty big enough for the button to go through. And the serger probably won't like to cut off those ends. It's a bit too much to put through the serger, so I'll trim off the ends of the loop, and then I'll be able to just serge the whole big long curved edge. So the edges go back together, clip it back in place, trim off my edges, and then head over to the serger. So I serge the big curved long edge all together, easy peasy. Good, and once I got to the end of that seam, just chain right off. That serged edge is just so nice, right? And then open it up and serge around the whole bottom edge, that straight edge that's all the way around the bottom. Once that edge is all serged, then I took it back to the cutting table and I could turn up a little hem, just about a finger width, maybe 1.5 centimeters or 1/2 to 5/8 of an inch. And I wanted to pin that in place. Just because going around that little end can be a little finicky, but yeah, just a finger width up is just fine. Pinning that edge up all the way around, nice and even. And then back to the regular sewing machine, and I wanted to sew that hem, but I do want to use a bit of a stretch stitch here because that edge will get stretched when you wrap it around your hair. So I used a long zigzag stitch, about, I think it was 3 millimeters long and 2 millimeters wide. And I just zigzagged right on top of that serged edge all the way around, just as straight as I could. Coming around that skinny end with the loop is a little tricky. You have to kind of condense the hem area a bit, but it's fine. It worked out just great. A little back tack to finish, and that is it. So you see how that loop is nicely in that hemmed area? That came out pretty nice and slick. I took it over to the iron because that bottom edge is a bit ripply. Condensed that all in Just a light, quick press to flatten out that area. And then all I need to do was sew on a button. I like to use a quadrupled thread. So here I've got like 2 arms length of thread, and I'm putting the 2 cut ends of the thread through the needle and bring that all down together so you have 4 threads coming out of your needle. Tie a big fat knot at the end. And then I start sewing that button on the outside, so the knot is going to get hidden by the button and the inside's going to be just totally clean looking. And I really dug into the seam there so it's nice and secure. I used a shank button, which I think kind of works well with that loop. It just gives more room underneath the button for that loop to pass under. But you could make it work with a 2 or 4 hole button, no problem. And there, that loop just comes around, goes over that button, perfect. So those ones are done. The hair wraps are done, they just button so nice. And then we're ready to move on to the sleep masks. So here's the final turban, all twisted up around my hair. I think it's really quite luxurious, and it just feels like a little bit of indulgence. Now, I made a video about making a sleep mask, and I'll link it here, but also in the description box. In the video, I made a pattern from a coffee cup, so I can link that here. So the silk charmeuse I bought the smallest amount that they will sell you, because it's expensive. Yeah, it was $50 a yard, so I bought the smallest amount that they will cut for you, which it turns out is about 5 inches deep. So this pattern I made just by tracing a sleep mask that I already had, and I traced it onto a folded piece of parchment paper to make sure it was symmetrical. And then I laid my silk charmeuse on top of the quilting cotton. Placed a few pins, and then cut out my pieces. And then I also needed a piece of batting for each of them. The batting I like to use is called warm and natural batting. It's also like an unbleached cotton, and it's lovely and lightweight, and it's perfect for this kind of project. So I'll put a link in the description to that if you want as well. So then this is all I had left from my silk charmeuse. Now you can just use elastic. This is a prettier like lingerie elastic. You could use something like that to go around the back, and that's quite pretty. But if you want like a little bit more luxury, you would take an elastic and encase it in the silk. So I chopped off the ends, then I cut 2 strips that are about 1.75 inches. And silk charmeuse just tears like beautifully straight if you make your cuts long enough. So I cut into that 1.75 inches and then tore 2 strips. And the silk just tears beautifully straight along 2 threads in the fabric. So nice, easy way to get 3 long strips. 2 of those strips are going to cover the elastic, and the elastic I cut about 15 inches. I'll later cut the whole thing off to be about 13.5, but I wanted just a little bit of extra to be able to maneuver with. So 2 pieces that were 15 inches. So those 2 strips of the silk will go to cover the elastic. And then all I had left for any kind of decorative element was this 1 strip. So I had to ponder for a second on what to do with that. I thought if I had bought just a little bit more silk, I could have done a ruffled edge around the whole sleep mask, but I just had this one little bit. So what I ended up doing was cutting it in half so that I could see exactly how much I had for each mask. And I played around with the idea of making just a little gathery bit at each side. I folded in half again and made 4 little sections, all with tapered ends. And then I took those to the iron and pressed them flat in half with the right side facing out. I made sure to test my needle out on this charmeuse because sometimes you'll need a finer needle and it'll make pulls across the silk. But this needle did just fine. It's just a universal needle, whether it was the 2 layers of silk or the silk to the cotton, no problem at all. But it was a good idea, I think, to test it out first. All right, so with my little folded pieces, you can see I kind of creased those and put them in half. And then I changed my stitch length to the longest stitch. So it's just a straight stitch, but with the length of 5 millimeters. So I ran that little gathering stitch around the curved edge, like the 2 curved edges together, not along the folded edge. And recently I've been reconverted to be using 2 rows of gathering stitch, but on such a tiny thing like this, I just used the 1 row of gathering thread, and that worked fine. So I sewed that for all the little pieces. And then I wanted to make sure that I placed them evenly. So I folded my cut pieces in half and I marked 3 little notches, one about 1.5 inches or so from the fold. And that's just for the little gap. And then 2 notches where I wanted the gathered bits to sit. And I snipped those notches through all of the layers. And then I started pinning that folded, gathered up piece onto the quilting cotton. I hadn't even pulled up the gathering thread yet. I pinned both ends according to those notches that I'd placed. Then I could pull up my gathering thread, gather that whole little piece up nicely. Once the length of the gathering thread was right, like the piece was fitting, then I did a figure 8 around the pin so that the thread couldn't slide back out. And then went to the other side, same thing, same thread, pull it up, figure 8 around the pin, and then kind of like evenly spread out those gathers. And lots of pins to hold that in place nicely. Made sure that both sides were the same, and loads of pins. And I wanted to make sure that I liked this before I made the second one. So I've only done it for one at this point. Now, the next thing I need to do before I put the mask together is to encase the elastic in the silk. And I messed up the filming of that part, so I'm recreating it here using a different satiny fabric. So I just fold the piece in half, right sides together, and made sure that it's big enough to encase that elastic. And then I'm just sewing at the edge of my presser foot, running along those 2 raw edges. So I just basically sew that tube like normal. And then again, a nice little fun way to turn a little tube like that, I stuck the safety pin through the elastic and through the tube, and then plunge that safety pin in, like dive it all the way through so it drags the elastic through at the same time that you're turning it out. And again, it's only tricky at the beginning. You have to help it at the beginning a little bit, tuck that first end in, and then once you start pushing that safety pin along, it all slides through together. And yeah, you can definitely do that in 2 separate steps if you want, but it is kind of fun to do it all in one. And it feels like very efficient with your time. And once you turn that all out, then you can see this elastic is encased in that bit of now stretchy silk. And then I did a triple zigzag all the way down the middle. So the triple zigzag, I used 5 millimeters wide and 4 millimeters long. And then I kept that elastic in a stretched out position and sewed with that triple zigzag all the way down the middle of that piece. Hold it front and back, keep it stretched out as you sew all the way down the middle. And then I was ready to put the whole thing together. So I put the elastic on. One thing I did better on the second one was I let the elastic stick out a little bit more at the edges here. On this first one, I just had it even, and I ended up missing like a little corner here or there. So have that elastic stick out a little bit more. And also I trimmed it down to 13.5 inches. That was a better length. So the ruffly piece on the sides and the elastic are all in between the layers. And I want to I'm bunching up the elastic here so that it stays out of my way as I'm sewing, and I kind of pin it to the middle. At the top there, that's where I'm going to be leaving a gap to turn it all right side out. The silk charmeuse goes on top then, so the whole piece is right side together, and the batting is sitting underneath. That's the order you have to have everything in. So then I'm sewing all the way around and leaving a gap at the top in the middle. You never want to leave a gap at any curvy place. Always look for the straightest section to leave your gap in. And the other thing I did better on the second one is I made sure that the silk was taut at the center there where the gap is. On the first one, it kind of bulged over the elastic, and then that extra fabric was a bit tricky to deal with. So I ended up with it not looking super great. You can see there that bunch in the middle. And on the second one, I made sure to make that much flatter so the silk was taut across where the gap was going to be. And that worked way better. I clipped all the way around, kind of working clips in between the million pins that I already had in there. It just kept everything together nice and secure. Good, and then I could just sew again just at the edge of my presser foot, taking out all the pins and clips as I went around. On some sewing machines, like older sewing machines that are not computerized, you can just sew over your pins. Not your clips, but you can sew over pins. But on a computerized machine, I don't recommend sewing over pins. You just run a really high risk of breaking a needle. So once it was sewn all the way around, then I just wanted to clip that bottom curve. That's an inside curve, and it could pucker and bend. And so just little clips around that curve help the seam allowance to spread out once you have it turned right side out. So just clip, clip, clip that bottom curve. The outside curves are fine. I didn't feel the need to cut those down at all. You know, it's a small enough seam allowance that those just sit fine, no problem. Then you can kind of tug on that elastic. I pulled out the pin and tug on that elastic to help you turn it right side out. Even those little ear ruffle parts help to give you an edge to pull on to turn it right side out nicely. So it's looking pretty good. I was pretty happy with that little side ruffle. Looks pretty cute. Then that top gap just needs to be dealt with. And there's a couple ways of dealing with that. I decided I was going to deal with mine by hand, just sewing a ladder stitch in between those layers. But first, you need to press it flat. You want to bring that seam right out to the edge and create that nice curved shape. If you've got any like corners or points, you want to go back inside and shave those off so you have a nice smooth curve. I think there was one little pointy bit here that I did go back in and shave off. Like just sewed a little bit more of a smooth curve. The gathering thread had done its job. Now it was done. So anywhere that the gathering thread showed, I could just pull it right out. Press the whole thing nice and flat. And then at the gap, just tuck those edges in and press those flat. So now I'm just going to use a single thread knotted at the end, starting by hiding my knot inside the fold. So my needle's coming out in the fold. And then the ladder stitch is just like back and forth, picking up a little stitch in the fold of the silk and then picking up a little stitch in the fold of the cotton. Just back and forth like that. Super simple. Don't let yourself get tangled. Nice easy hand stitch. I think it's a nice way to go. You can do a little edge stitch on your machine all the way around the whole sleep mask, and that can be the way that you close up this gap. But I just didn't want to have to fiddle around too much and make sure that my stitching looked beautiful on the inside and the outside. And I really wanted that silk side to look just as beautiful as the outside. For me, the hand sewing was the better way to go here. Before you cut your thread, stick your needle out anywhere, pull your thread tight, cut your tail of thread, and then your tail of thread gets hidden inside the 2 layers. So that's a nice way to finish it off. So the eye masks are done, and I think they're super cute. And that silk charmeuse definitely makes them feel much more luxurious. So here's the finished product, and that silk covered elastic is really, really nice on the hair. Super cute. So for the rice bags, I made an inside pillow to contain the rice, and that was just made with 2 pieces of unbleached cotton muslin that were 5 inches by 10 inches. And so then I just took the 2 layers and sewed a U shape around those. Nice clean pivots at the corners. And then I trimmed off the extra around the corners and turned the bag right side out. I used a chopstick to poke out the corners nice and pointy, and then I kind of dragged the chopstick against the seam so that it helped get that seam right out to the edge and press that all flat. I used brown rice and I put a few drops of essential oils in there and used the chopstick to stir it up, and it just smelled like heaven. And then I tried pouring the rice in, but of course got rice everywhere. So then I got to be a bit smarter, ran to my recycling bin and found an empty pop bottle and cut off the end of it. And that made the perfect funnel. Tuck the edges in and put a couple clips. And then took that to the sewing machine and just sewed right nice and close to the edge right across the end of both of the little pillows. Now, my linen, I like to snip and tear long skinny things, but the linen I knew was not going to tear very well. So another nice trick is to just grab a couple threads and shuffle them along. It's almost like gathering, but you're using the actual threads of the fabric. And the thread will eventually break and you pull it, but when you shuffle it back, it draws a line for you right on the grain of the fabric. Can you see that line there? I could just cut right along that line, no problem at all. And that now gives me a cut edge that's exactly on grain. So I cut just as far as I could see the line. Once I couldn't see it clearly anymore, pick up a couple threads again and pull a little way along. Sometimes you have fabrics that are loosely woven enough that you can just pull that thread right out, and then it gives you a really nice clear line right across the whole grain of the fabric. But it's just a nice fun little trick to find the exact grain of the fabric. So there's the line, and just slice right on that line. So then I could put my 2 cut edges together, and I wanted it 5 inches long, so I just let 1 inch hang off my ruler and sliced it into 5-inch strips. So for the linen, I wanted the pieces to be 23 inches by 5. So once I have those cut, I'm just going to turn a little folded edge on each end. So I started off at the iron with that and just turn a little edge and pressed. And the linen just presses so nicely, right? So I folded an edge, press, and then turn again and press again. And they fold both the same way. There's not really a right and a wrong side to the linen. They fold into the same side. If there is a right and a wrong side, you would turn them both to the wrong side, both ends. And I just sewed those little hems up. And then took it back over to my cutting table and I made a 3-inch fold on one side and folded the other end in just so there was about a finger width in between the two hems. And this is all right side together because now with that little hem, the fabric does have a right and a wrong side. So I put a clip in between. There's just like a clip width in between those folds. Good. And then back to the machine with that. Sewed up both sides, nice and even. And then I took those to the serger and serged those edges. And for sure there, you could definitely just zigzag, no problem at all. Now I wanted to flip those right side out, so the chopstick came in handy again and press those nice and flat. And the linen is just so satisfying to work with. It just feels lovely and it presses beautifully. It's just gorgeous to work with. Once those are pressed flat, that is really it. Now I just had to get the rice pillow inside, which was not that easy. But I found it easier to start with the sort of emptier end of the rice bag. Get that empty end in there first, and then kind of let the rice pour itself into the linen pillow, and then I could work it in. Give it a little shake, kind of even it up. Corners are nicely filled in, and that worked out great. So my little treasure trove of gifts is growing. Now for the journal cover. This journal I found at the dollar store, and it's kind of cute, but it's definitely not the vibe I was going for. To make a cover, I wanted to get a measurement going around the book when the book is closed, and mine was 10 1/4 around. And I want a piece of fabric, and it can be one piece or pieced together like multiple seams, but I want it to be twice the length of the book. So for me, when I do math, I just fold the tape measure. So 10 1/4 gave me 20 1/2. Plus, I want another 10 inches. So I want a piece of fabric that's 30 1/2 inches long. And for sure, I could have done it all out of the solid linen. And that might be more to your aesthetic, a little bit more modern and sleek. That would be 100% fine. But I wanted to piece together with my quilting cotton. And I also wanted to put a lining on the inside of the cotton muslin, just so I wasn't like wasting that linen. I decided I wanted to have equal parts. The quilting cotton would be 1/4 of it, the linen would be 2/4, and the muslin would be 1/4. So I wanted to take my measurement of 30 1/2 and divide it by 4. And for me, the best way to do that is just fold that measuring tape into 4, which gave me 7 5/8. Now you have to add seam allowance onto each of those. My measurement that I'm keeping in my head is the height of my book is 7 inches almost exactly. And so I want to add seam allowance, so 8 inches tall by 8 5/8. Each of my pieces that are going in to make this big circle, those are the measurements that I'm working with. Just add seam allowance, 1/2 inch on each end, but the width of your book times 2 plus 10 inches. So I cut 2 pieces of the linen, and don't forget for every seam you're adding, you have to add seam allowance to that seam. So I cut out my squares according to those measurements. The next thing I needed to cut is a piece of interfacing. You want the interfacing to be the exact same size as the book when it's open. So I just traced around that book when it's laying flat like that. I didn't end up rounding off my corners. That's just too hard for this technique. I kept the corners squared, cut out my interfacing, and then I wanted to divide that interfacing among the 3 pieces that are going to be making the outside of the cover. So I made a mark that just at the seam allowance edge, and then the rest of the interfacing got divided into 2 strips. So I want one piece that's the full square, except for seam allowance, and then what's left of the interfacing, I cut into 2 strips. So for me, it's going to be the quilting cotton that gets the full piece of interfacing. So I just centered that interfacing onto the quilting cotton. And remember, glue side down onto wrong side. And then each of the linen pieces is going to get one of the strips. And again, glue side down onto wrong side. So this is all going to make sense once you see how this technique is going to work. It took me a little while to figure out how I wanted to do this, but it worked out nicely. So I ironed on each of those 3 pieces of interfacing, and then I pinned together the seams that I was going to be sewing. I just stuck 1 pin in each just at the top. So the quilting cotton is sort of centered between the 2 pieces of linen, and then the muslin connects the 2 pieces of linen on the other side. So 1 pin there, and then kind of wrap all the way around so that the last piece of linen connects with the piece of muslin. So you see how that's making one big tube, and that tube is equal to twice the length of the book plus 10 inches, right? Now I sewed those seams and pressed them flat. And then I started playing around with that ecru lace. And it's just a natural cotton lace. I thought it was really pretty. But again, you do you. Like, make it your aesthetic. Some people might think that that's starting to get a bit granny-ish. I didn't want to get too carried away in that direction, but I did think it was really, really pretty. A nice little touch of lace without getting too carried away. But if that's not your aesthetic, just leave that off. That's totally optional, of course. Once it was all sewn, then I could just trim off the ends of the lace. I wanted to then find the center. That muslin is the lining side. I want to find the center of that edge and of the quilting cotton. So I folded it in half, like matching up the seams, and then I could just finger press a little crease down the center of the quilting cotton and the muslin. Then I could bring those two center lines together. I laid the spine of the book right on that center line and made sure it kind of wrapped around there nice and even and cozy. Then I tucked that edge, like wrapped one edge around the front cover of the book and put a pin horizontally at the top and a pin horizontal at the bottom. So I'm just making like a little pocket and then close the book up again and do the same thing. You have to make sure that that'll wrap nicely when the book is closed, right? You need the fabric to be able to make it all the way around the book. So it fits nicely like that. That's working well. So then I could easily pull the book out. Then I started thinking about the elastic that came with that journal. And I thought, well, I don't want to lose that. Might as well put it to good use. So I cut it right off and then put that elastic aside. And then I have to rearrange my pins now. I don't want to be pinning all 4 layers of the fabric together. I have to slide my horizontal pins out and replace them with vertical pins that are just holding the 3 top layers together and let that back layer be free. I'm pinning the little fold just to the inside part, just to the lining part. Good. And so that whole back part of the journal cover is still free. So just slide out the pin, release the back, slide the pin right back in. Then I could take my little elastic and I just put it over one end and then just pinned it at both ends. And again, just through the top 3 layers, leaving that back layer free. So basically all the parts are in place now. And then I can just flip that whole thing inside out. Careful of those pins, but flip it inside out. And then you're going to now repin again, but from the inside. Again, slide the pin out, slide it back in, this time through all 4 layers. And also I just want to make sure that that elastic is caught into one of my pins as well. Then that goes back to the regular machine and I'm sewing across both ends, leaving a gap in the middle of, I think it's nicer to leave the gap in the middle of the bottom side, but really it's just straight across both ends, but leave your little gap. You need that gap to be able to turn it right side out. Turning it right side out through that gap. And again, I want my chopstick nearby to help me poke out those corners nice and pointy. So there's a pocket on each end for the edge of the journal to stick into. I gave the whole thing a nice press flat. And then to close up the gap, you could again do a little edge stitch or you could do a ladder stitch. But you know what? I actually didn't even close up my gap. It's just never going to show when it's wrapping around a book. So I just didn't even close it up. Give the whole thing a nice press flat, looking good. And then one end of the journal tucks into one side. You're going to have to bend the book backwards a little bit to get the other end in. And this journal had that little ribbon, which is the exact same color as the elastic, which kind of all goes with the same aesthetic. I love that. That's so pretty. The elastic kind of holds it wherever you are in the journal. That looks great. Last gift now is going to be the cosmetic wipes. I cut squares that were 3 inches out of just a strip of the cotton flannelette and out of little scraps of my terry towel. I could also have done one side out of the quilting cotton, but I thought maybe best for a cosmetic wipe to be a little more of a washable fabric. So then I made a whole video on sewing these little cosmetic wipes where I just zigzagged them together with the right side facing out. And that's fine. I'll link that video here and in the description. But I think since I wanted this to be more of like a luxurious gift, I think it is nicer to sew it wrong sides together first and then turn out the squares. So you see here I've got one toe of the presser foot sticking out over the edge. So it's less than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I did nice clean pivots and then lift a little gap on one side. I had 10 of each square, so I sewed around 10 squares. And then took them back to my cutting table and cut off 4 little corners. And then used my chopstick to turn them all right side out and nice and pointy. I took them to the iron and put 1 pin at each gap. And then for this one, yes, I definitely wanted to do an edge stitch around here on the machine. No hand sewing on the little cosmetic wipes. That would be crazy. So yep, sewing around all 10 of those little squares. And they just came out nice, just easy peasy. That's a great little gift. And then here's my finished collection of gifts. They look so pretty together. Some people might get 1 or 2 of the gifts. Some people might get all the gifts. However you want to divide it up and give it to the people that you care about and who you want to see indulge in their own self-care. I think they're all really thoughtful gifts and they were all really, really fun to make. So that wraps up our self-care thoughtful gift giving, and I'll be giving myself quite a bit of self-care to try to get my voice back on track. I hope you enjoyed that. It was really great having you along for the ride. Thank you so much, and until next time on Catherine Sews, you take care.